I want to say up front that I've told this story maybe 4 times to people who know me, and every single time I leave something out because I'm still not sure how to say it without sounding insane. So I'm just going to type it the way I remember it in order and let you decide what you think happened. My name's Dana. I'm 31, I work as a labor and delivery nurse at a hospital outside Knoxville, Tennessee, and in September of 2024, I went camping alone at Frozen Head State Park, up near Wartburg. If you're not from East Tennessee, Frozen Head is this big stretch of forest in the Cumberland Mountains, a lot of backcountry trail. A handful of designated primitive camping sites strung along Panther Branch and up toward Bird Mountain. I'd been there before twice, both times with my ex, and after we split I told myself I was going to go back and do it by myself, prove to myself I could. I'd been planning the trip for about 6 weeks. I had a 2-person tent, a Jetboil stove, enough freeze-dried meals for 3 days, and I'd told my sister, Meredith, exactly which trailhead I was parking at and when to expect a text from me each night. I got to the ranger station around 1:40 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I remember the time because I'd left work at 7 that morning after a 12-hour overnight shift, slept about 4 hours in my car in a Kroger parking lot in Oak Ridge, and then finished the drive. I was tired in that specific way where your eyes feel dry and your thoughts are a half second behind everything, but I wasn't worried about it. I figured I'd set up camp, eat, and crash early. The ranger who checked me in was an older guy, maybe 60, heavyset, name tag said R. Cobble. He asked if I was solo and I said yes, and he did this thing where he sort of nodded slowly and said, "All right. Well, Site 14's open if you want 14. It's got the best water access, but you'll have neighbors in 12 and 15 this weekend. There's a scout troop coming in tomorrow." I told him that was fine. In hindsight, I wonder if I should have asked more questions, but at the time it just sounded like small talk. I hiked in about 2.5 miles to Site 14, which took me a little over an hour with my pack. The trail follows the creek most of the way, and by the time I got there, the light was already starting to go gold and slanted through the trees. That late afternoon color that makes everything look like a filter. Site 14 was pretty, honestly, a flat clearing maybe 30 feet off the water, ringed by rhododendron, with a stone fire ring somebody had built up nice with flat rocks. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and by 6 I had a fire going and was heating water for a dehydrated pad thai packet, feeling pretty proud of myself. I didn't see or hear anyone else that first evening. No scout troop yet, nobody in 12 or 15. I fell asleep around 9, which is early for me, but I was running on almost no real sleep and the exhaustion just took me under. I woke up at 2:13 a.m. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone. I don't know what woke me up at first, no specific sound, just that feeling of surfacing out of sleep with your heart already going a little fast. Like your body knew something before your brain caught up. I lay there for a second listening. The fire had burned down to nothing. I could hear the creek steady and low and wind moving through the rhododendron leaves, which makes this dry, papery rattle that's different from regular leaves. And then I heard footsteps. Not fast, not sneaking exactly, just slow, deliberate steps on packed dirt, coming from somewhere behind my tent, on the side away from the creek. They stopped. I remember lying completely still, staring at the shape of my pack against the tent wall, trying to convince myself it was a deer. Deer walk around campsites at night all the time, I told myself. Raccoons, a bear, even though bears don't usually walk like that, evenly spaced, unhurried. Then I heard breathing. Not my own, I was holding my breath, actually, but a low, steady exhale, maybe 8 or 10 feet from the tent. Human breathing. I've delivered enough babies and sat with enough families to know what a human breathing pattern sounds like versus an animal's, and this was a person. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just lay there gripping the inside of my sleeping bag with both hands, waiting. After maybe 30 seconds, though it felt a lot longer, the footsteps started again, moving away back toward the trail, unhurried the whole time. Like whoever it was wanted me to hear them, leaving just as clearly as I'd heard them arrive. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up with my headlamp off, just listening, until it started getting light around 6:30. When I finally unzipped the tent, I checked around the site. There were footprints in the soft dirt behind the tent, boot prints, a men's size by the look of them, maybe 11 or 12. They led from the trail, circled around behind my tent, and went back out the same way. I told myself it was probably another hiker who'd gotten turned around in the dark, realized someone was camped there, and left. That's a normal thing that happens. People get lost on trails at night more than you'd think. I almost packed up and left that morning. I sat with my coffee, instant, tasted like a campfire and cardboard, turning it over in my head. But it was daylight, birds were going, and I felt a little embarrassed at how scared I'd let myself get over some footprints. I texted Meredith, rough night, heard someone walking around camp, prob a lost hiker. Staying another night, we'll check in at 8. She sent back a string of question marks and then call me if anything, and I told her I would. The scout troop showed up around 11 that morning, filling Site 12 and 15 just like Ranger Cobble had said, a cluster of maybe 14 boys and 3 adult leaders. Loud in that specific way kids are loud when they're excited to be outside. Honestly, it made me feel better, more people around. I spent the day hiking a loop up toward the fire tower on Bird Mountain, came back around 4, and one of the scout leaders, a woman named Patricia, maybe mid-40s. Friendly, walked over while I was refilling my water at the creek. "You're at 14, right?" she asked. I said yes. She said, "One of my boys said he saw a guy standing at the tree line by your site this morning, real early, before we even had breakfast going. Just standing there. Didn't think much of it till you mentioned the footprints thing to Ranger Cobble." I hadn't mentioned anything to Ranger Cobble. I hadn't seen him again since check-in, so I asked her what she meant. And she looked a little confused and said, "Oh, I just assumed somebody radioed the station about a report near Site 14. Maybe I've got it wrong." That unsettled me more than the footsteps had, honestly. The idea that there was already some kind of report, that other people had independently noticed something, made it feel less like a nervous imagination thing and more like a fact. I asked which boy had seen the man, and she pointed to a kid, maybe 11 years old, sitting near their fire ring. I walked over and asked him, as gently as I could, what he'd seen. He said, and I remember this pretty precisely because I made him repeat it twice, there was a guy just standing there by the trees. He had a flashlight, but he wasn't using it, he was just holding it. He was looking at the tent. I asked what the man looked like. The kid shrugged and said, "Just a guy. He had a jacket. Camo, I think." I asked if he said anything to an adult right away, and he said he told Patricia later that morning after breakfast. I want to be honest that at this point I genuinely considered hiking out that afternoon. I had cell signal, barely, 1 bar if I stood on a rock near the creek. But it was Friday, more people were arriving for the weekend, and I told myself that a man in a camo jacket near a state park at 6 a.m. wasn't exactly a smoking gun, could have been another hiker. Could have been someone scouting a hunting spot, even though hunting wasn't in season there. I decided to stay, but I moved my tent that afternoon to be closer to the creek, in clearer sightline of the scout camp, and I told Patricia I'd appreciate it if her group kept an eye out. That night I didn't fall asleep until close to midnight, and when I did, it wasn't for long. At 11:47 p.m. again, I checked my phone. I woke up to the sound of someone unzipping my rainfly. Not fully, just a few inches, that specific ratcheting sound a zipper makes when it's being pulled slow and careful instead of yanked. I was awake instantly, adrenaline just flooding through me so hard my hands were shaking before I even sat up. I grabbed my headlamp and turned it on and pointed it at the rainfly door, and through the gap I saw, for maybe half a second less, a hand. Just a hand, pale, gripping the edge of the zipper pull. Then it was gone, and I heard someone moving fast away from the tent, crashing through brush rather than walking the trail this time, branches snapping. Moving toward the creek, and then I lost the sound of it entirely under the water noise. I started screaming. I'm not proud of it exactly, it wasn't dignified, but I screamed for the scout camp, screamed Patricia's name because it was the only name I had. Within maybe 90 seconds, I had 3 adults at my tent with flashlights, one of them, a man named Greg, already on the radio to the ranger station. I was shaking too hard to really explain what happened at first. Patricia sat with me, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders that smelled like campfire smoke, and I remember her saying, "You're okay, you're okay." Breathe, over and over while I tried to get the words out. Ranger Cobble hiked in with another ranger about 40 minutes later, closer to 1 a.m. They searched the area around my site and along the creek trail with flashlights but found nothing. No more footprints they could clearly identify as fresh, no sign of anyone. Cobble was kind about it, but I could tell part of him was skeptical, in the gentle way people get skeptical when they don't want to accuse you of anything but also don't quite believe you. He said something like, sometimes at night, especially when you're not used to being out here alone, sounds get bigger than they are. I told him about the hand. I told him I saw it clearly, that it wasn't a raccoon or a branch or my imagination. He wrote it down. He told me I was welcome to hike out that night with them if I wanted an escort back to my car. Or I could move into the scout group's cleared area for the rest of the night and reassess in the morning. I moved into the scout camp. I sat by their fire, wrapped in that blanket until it started getting light, and I don't think I actually slept at all that second night. Around 5 a.m., one of the older boys, a 15-year-old named Tyler who was on watch duty for the fire, quietly came and sat near me and said, I saw him too, earlier. Before the lady screamed, I asked him why he hadn't said anything. He said, I thought I was imagining it, and then everybody was already freaking out, so I didn't want to make it worse. I asked him what he saw. He said the man had been standing at the edge of the trees near their camp, not moving, for what felt like several minutes, just watching. And then walked off toward my site right around the time, as close as Tyler could estimate that I must have been asleep. I packed up at first light and hiked out with the scout group's help. 2 of the adult leaders walked me the whole 2.5 miles to the trailhead, even though it put them behind on their own schedule, and I will be grateful to those people for the rest of my life. Strangers who didn't have to do that. I filed a report at the ranger station. Cobble took it seriously this time, said they'd have extra patrols through the weekend, gave me a card with the park's non-emergency line. I never heard anything definitive after that. I called about 2 weeks later to ask if there'd been any other incidents reported, and the woman I spoke to said she didn't have anything on file for that period besides my report, which was strange. Because I know for a fact multiple people saw someone that weekend, Tyler, the 11-year-old scout, Patricia relaying what she'd been told me. I don't know if it just never got properly logged, or if it got logged as something else, some general, suspicious person note that got filed away without connecting the dots. Here's the detail that still bothers me, the one thing I never resolved. When Ranger Cobble and the other rangers searched around my tent that night with flashlights, they found the zipper pull on my rainfly, the actual little tab of fabric and metal you grip to open it, sitting on the ground about 4 feet from the tent, not attached to anything. It hadn't broken off the zipper track, it had been cut off. A clean cut, like from a knife or a very sharp pair of scissors, right through the fabric loop. I didn't notice it myself until Cobble pointed it out and asked if I'd done that, and I told him no, I'd never touch it, why would I cut my own tent? Nobody ever explained why someone would go to the trouble of cutting off a zipper pull and leaving it on the ground rather than just taking it, or destroying it, or leaving no trace at all. It felt, and this is the part I can't fully articulate even now, deliberate, like it was meant to be found. Like whoever it was wanted me to know later in the daylight, once I was calm enough to notice details, that they'd been close enough to cut something off my tent with me inside it. And that they'd wanted me to find proof of that on their terms after they were already gone. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike during the day in groups. I still keep that little cut zipper pull in a Ziploc bag in a drawer in my apartment, which I know probably sounds strange, but I've never been able to throw it away. Sometimes I take it out and look at it and try to figure out what it means, and I never get anywhere. I don't know who he was. I don't know if he was ever caught doing this to somebody else, somewhere else, under some other name in some other file that never got cross-referenced with mine. I just know that somebody stood close enough to me in the dark to cut a piece off my tent with precision and patience, and then walked away into the trees, and I will never know why. Story 2, Site 22. I've never posted this anywhere before, but I figure typing it out might finally get it out of my head, or at least get it somewhere other than just in my head. My name's Marcus. I'm 26, I drive for a regional delivery company out of Flagstaff, Arizona, and this happened Labor Day weekend of 2025 at a campground in the Coconino National Forest off Lake Mary Road, at a spot called Pine Grove Campground. I want to say first that I wasn't alone out there. I went with my friend Devin, who I've known since high school, and his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Priya. We'd been planning the trip for a while, nothing fancy, just a long weekend, some hiking, a cooler full of beer, that kind of thing. We got two sites next to each other, 21 and 22, because the campground was full for the holiday and that's all they had available together. Devin and Priya took 21. I took 22 mostly because I was the one who showed up a couple hours after them, and 22 was what was left of the two. The campground itself is pretty developed, not backcountry, paved loop, vault toilets, a camp host in an RV near the entrance, maybe 40 sites total, most of them full that weekend with families. A few groups of college kids, a couple of older, retired-looking couples with the big fifth-wheel trailers. It didn't feel remote or sketchy. That's actually part of why what happened stuck with me so much. It happened in a place that felt safe, with people all around. I set up my tent Friday evening, a one-person deal I'd had since college, right at the edge of my site closest to the tree line, because that's where the ground was flattest. Devin and Priya's site was maybe 40 feet away, close enough that we could talk without shouting. We grilled, had a few beers, sat around their fire until close to midnight, and then I walked back to my own site and crashed. Nothing happened that first night. I want to be clear about that because I don't want to make this sound like it was wall-to-wall dread from minute one. Friday was completely normal. Saturday we hiked out to the Fisher Point area, did maybe 6 miles round trip, came back exhausted and sunburned and happy, cooked dinner, had a good night. It was Saturday night late when things started. I woke up around 1:15 a.m. to my phone buzzing, a text from Priya. It said, "Do you have your headlamp on? Someone's walking around by your tent." I remember staring at the screen for a second, confused, because my headlamp was off, sitting in the mesh pocket by my head where I always keep it. I texted back, "No, not me." She didn't respond right away. About 20 seconds later she texted, "Okay, he's gone now." Weird SRY. I asked what she'd seen exactly, and she said a light moving slow around the back of my tent for maybe a minute, and then it had gone off. I unzipped my tent and looked around with my own headlamp. Nothing. No footprints I could make out on the packed gravel, no sign of anyone. I walked over to Devin and Priya's site, and Priya was sitting up in their tent doorway, Devin still asleep next to her, and she told me again what she'd seen, a light dim, bobbing like someone was walking with it low near my tent, and she'd assumed it was me getting up to pee or something until she noticed my tent was still zipped shut the whole time. We decided it was probably another camper who'd wandered off from a nearby site, maybe someone looking for their own tent in the dark after a few too many. Which happens constantly at a place like that on a holiday weekend. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep well, but I did sleep. Sunday during the day, nothing unusual, more hiking, a trip into town for ice, a long afternoon just sitting around camp. Around 6 that evening, while I was filling up water bottles at the pump near the bathrooms, I got to talking with the camp host, a woman probably in her 60s named Sandra, who ran the little check-in booth near the entrance. Small talk mostly, but I mentioned, half joking, that someone had been wandering around our sites with a flashlight the night before. Her expression changed in a way I noticed immediately, this kind of tightening around her eyes. She said, "Which sites are you in?" I told her 21 and 22. She got quiet for a second and then said, "We had a report a couple weeks back. A family in 22 said someone was looking in their tent windows at night. Well, the mesh, not windows exactly, but looking in. They packed up and left a day early. I don't know if it's the same person, could be nothing, but I wanted you to know since you're in that same site." I asked her if they'd caught whoever it was, or reported it to anyone beyond the campground. She said the family had called it in to the county sheriff, but as far as she knew, nothing had come of it, no suspect, no follow-up that she'd heard about. She told me she'd have her husband, who also worked the campground, do an extra walkthrough of that loop that night. I appreciated it, but I also felt this creeping unease settle into my stomach that didn't go away for the rest of the evening. I told Devin and Priya what Sandra had said. Devin, in his usual way, tried to make a joke out of it, said something like, "Guy's probably just some lonely weirdo who gets off on flashlights, harmless." Priya didn't laugh. She suggested I just sleep in their tent with them that night, which in hindsight I really should have done. But I was 26 and a little bit proud, and didn't want to be the guy who got scared out of his own tent by a rumor. I told them I'd be fine and that if anything happened I'd yell. I fell asleep around midnight. I woke up at 2:41 a.m. to the sound of someone breathing directly outside the mesh window of my tent, maybe 18 inches from my face. on the other side of a thin nylon wall and a layer of mesh screen. Slow, deliberate breathing, like someone standing very still and just waiting. I didn't move. I don't think I even breathed myself for what felt like a full minute. I could make out just barely in the dim ambient light from the half moon, a shape, a silhouette of a person crouched down at window height, head tilted slightly, like they were looking in. I want to be honest that I froze completely. I know people always say I would have screamed or I would have fought back, but in that moment my entire body just locked up. I lay there staring at that shape through the mesh, and it stared back, I'm certain of that. Even though I couldn't see eyes, I could feel the direction of attention. If that makes any sense, for what felt like several minutes, but was probably closer to 30 or 40 seconds. Then it spoke. Just a few words, quiet, almost conversational, like someone continuing a conversation rather than starting one. You're not the one who was here before. I don't know what that means to this day. I've turned it over in my head 100 times, like he was talking about the family from 2 weeks earlier, the ones who'd left early because of him. Like he'd expected them to still be in that spot, or was disappointed or confused that a stranger had taken their place. That's when I finally moved, scrambling back away from the window, grabbing my phone, and the shape was gone by the time I got my headlamp on and looked again. No sound of footsteps, nothing. Just gone, like he'd been there and then simply wasn't. I started yelling for Devin. Within a minute, he and Priya were both up. And Devin actually grabbed a hatchet we'd brought for splitting kindling and walked the perimeter of both sites with his own headlamp while Priya called Sandra's number, which she'd saved from earlier. Sandra and her husband, a big quiet guy named Walt, came down in their golf cart within about 10 minutes. Walt did a wider sweep with a spotlight, checked the tree line, checked the vault toilets, checked a couple of the unattended sites nearby. Nothing, no one. Sandra called the sheriff's non-emergency line, and a deputy actually did drive out, maybe 40 minutes later, which I was surprised by given it was the middle of the night on a holiday weekend. But I think the fact that this was a second reported incident at the same site got it bumped up in priority. The deputy took my statement, walked the area himself, found nothing conclusive, some disturbed pine needles near my tent that could have been footprints or could have been nothing. No clear boot print in the harder ground. None of us slept the rest of that night. We sat around Devin and Priya's fire until it got light, and we packed up and left that morning, a full day earlier than we'd planned. All three of us in near silence for most of the drive back into Flagstaff. I called the sheriff's office about 10 days later to see if there'd been any update. The deputy I spoke to, different one than the night of, a woman this time, pulled up the report and told me they had 2 prior calls associated with that specific site over the past 2 months. Mine included both describing a man, no clear physical description beyond average build, approaching tents at night. And in one case entering a partially unzipped vestibule and going through someone's gear without taking anything, just moving things around before leaving. She said they didn't have a suspect, and that without a clearer description or any physical evidence. There wasn't much more they could actively do beyond flagging the site for extra patrols during peak season. The detail that still gets to me, more than the breathing or even what he said, is something I didn't notice until I was back home unpacking my gear. My headlamp, the one that had been sitting untouched in the mesh pocket by my head the whole night. The one I specifically remember checking during the first incident on Saturday, had its batteries removed. Not dead, removed, sitting loose in the bottom of the pocket. The little battery door popped open and left that way. I never opened that compartment. I hadn't touched it all weekend. Someone had gone into my tent at some point, quietly enough that I never woke up for it, taken the batteries out of my headlamp, and put them back loose instead of just leaving the whole thing alone or taking it entirely. I've thought about it a lot. Maybe it was meant to make sure I couldn't get a light on fast if something happened. Maybe it was something else, some kind of message I'm not smart enough to decode, the same way I still don't know what "you're not the one who was here before" was supposed to mean. Devin and I still talk about that trip sometimes, and every time he says the same thing: we should have just left the second Sandra told us about the other family. He's probably right. I still camp sometimes, but never in Coconino County anymore, and I check every zipper and every compartment before I go to sleep now, every single time. Even at established campgrounds surrounded by other people, because I learned that weekend that surrounded by other people doesn't mean nearly as much as I thought it did. Story 3, The Man from Site 9. I've gone back and forth for almost a year on whether to write this down anywhere. Partly because I still feel a little guilty about how it ended, even though I know none of it was my fault. My name's Renata. I'm 34, I work night shift as a dispatcher for a county EMS service outside Bend, Oregon, and this happened in July of 2024 at a campground called Elk Lake. Up in the Deschutes National Forest, off the Cascade Lakes Highway. I'd gone with 3 friends from work, Josh, who's a paramedic, his wife Colleen, and a coworker of mine named Beatriz, who does dispatch with me on the overnight rotation. We'd all been wanting to get out of town together for a while, and Elk Lake seemed perfect. A real lake, a little general store, developed sites with a boat launch, not backcountry at all. The kind of place families go for the 4th of July. We got there on a Friday in mid-July, a week after the holiday crowd had thinned out, and got set up at Site 11, right along the tree line with a decent view down to the water. The site next to us, Site 9, already had a guy set up there when we arrived, a single tent, a small pop-up canopy, a folding table with a camp stove. He waved when we pulled in, friendly enough, and introduced himself while we were unloading. His name was Perry, or that's what he told us. Mid-40s maybe, average height, wearing a faded ball cap the whole time I ever saw him, so I genuinely couldn't tell you his hair color. He said he was up from Klamath Falls, said he came to Elk Lake a lot, knew the area well, offered to show us a good spot to launch a kayak if we had one. Josh chatted with him for a few minutes while we set up. He seemed like a totally normal guy. A little chatty maybe, a little too eager to talk, but nothing that raised any flags, not at first. Over the course of that first evening, Perry kept finding small reasons to come over. He brought over a bag of ice he said he had extra of. He asked Colleen what she did for work, and when she said she taught 3rd grade, he said his niece was a teacher too. Asked a lot of follow-up questions about which school, which district. Stuff that felt like normal small talk in the moment, but that I found myself half remembering later with a different feeling attached to it. He asked Beatriz and me what we did, and when we said EMS dispatch, he got noticeably more interested, asked what our shifts were like, whether we worked nights, how the county services were set up. Whether dispatch worked out of a shared building with the sheriff's department. I remember answering some of it without thinking much of it, because talking to strangers about your job is just a normal thing people do at a campground. By Saturday, Perry had positioned his folding chair at the edge of his site closest to ours, and every time one of us stepped outside our tent, he seemed to already be looking over. Not staring exactly, nothing you could point to and call rude, but present, in this consistent way that started to feel less like coincidence the more it happened. Josh went for a run Saturday morning along the lake trail and told us afterward that Perry had asked, unprompted when he got back, "Good run. You went the long way around past the boat ramp, right?" Which was accurate, but Josh hadn't told him his route beforehand. He'd apparently just watched him leave and correctly guessed, or watched him the whole way, which felt like a strange amount of attention to pay to a stranger's jog. Saturday afternoon, Beatriz and I walked down to the little camp store to get more ice and a couple of things we'd forgotten. It's maybe a 10-minute walk from our site along the camp road. On the way back, Beatriz mentioned, kind of offhand, that she thought she'd seen Perry earlier that day parked in the small dirt lot near the trailhead on the opposite side of the lake from our site, nowhere near his own campsite, sitting in his truck. She hadn't thought much of it until she put it together with how much time he seemed to be spending watching our site specifically, rather than doing much of anything at his own. That night Saturday, we had a fire going, a few beers, nothing crazy, and Perry came over uninvited around 9:30, sat down without really being asked, and stayed for almost 2 hours. He was talkative in a way that started to feel exhausting rather than friendly, and at one point, out of nowhere, he said to me, "You said you work nights, right? Must be nice, quiet drive home in the morning, nobody around." I said something non-committal, and he said, "I bet that's a little scary sometimes, though. Pretty girl driving alone at that hour." I remember the exact feeling of that comment landing wrong, this little drop in my stomach, because nothing about it was said aggressively. It was said almost gently, but it felt like he was picturing something specific when he said it, not just making conversation. Josh, to his credit, redirected the conversation pretty smoothly, and not long after, Perry said goodnight and went back to his own site. But once he was gone, all four of us kind of looked at each other, and Colleen said what we were all thinking: that guy is off. We talked quietly for a while about whether we were overreacting. Whether it was just an awkward, lonely guy who didn't have great social instincts, or whether it was something worse. We didn't reach a conclusion. We just agreed to keep our distance the next day and not engage as much. Sunday, Perry seemed to pick up on the shift in energy and mostly kept to himself. Though I caught him watching our site several times throughout the day when he thought no one was looking, through the gap in his canopy. Or over the top of a paperback he never seemed to actually be reading. Around 6 that evening, he packed up his campsite entirely, tent, canopy, everything, loaded his truck, and drove off without saying goodbye. We all felt this collective relief, this loosening in the group, like something had lifted. We should have felt more suspicious about how abruptly he left, in hindsight. Instead, we just felt glad. We had a normal, relaxed evening, cooked dinner, sat by the fire late, went to bed sometime around midnight. Josh and Colleen were in one tent, Beatrice and I were sharing another. I woke up at 3:02 a.m. to the sound of a truck engine idling close, not on the campground's paved loop, but somewhere just off it. On one of the unmarked service roads that thread through that section of forest near the lake. I lay there listening to it for a long time, at least 10 minutes, the engine just running steadily, not moving, not turning off. Beatrice woke up too, and we lay there in the dark, whispering, trying to figure out where exactly it was coming from. It seemed close enough that whoever it was would have had to leave the main road and drive down toward our loop specifically, which didn't make sense for through traffic at that hour. Eventually the engine cut off, then nothing, just silence, the kind of silence that feels louder than actual sound, if that makes sense, because you're straining so hard to hear something. About 20 minutes later, we heard footsteps on gravel, slow, coming from the direction the truck sound had come from, moving along the edge of our site. I want to describe exactly what happened next as precisely as I can, because it's the part I've replayed the most. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent, on the side where our gear was stacked in the vestibule. And then someone unzipped the outer rainfly zipper of the vestibule, not our inner tent door, just the outside flap, slow, careful, one continuous pull. I could see, through the mesh of our inner door, a flashlight beam moving across our packed gear, methodical, like they were looking for something specific rather than just poking around randomly. Beatrice grabbed my arm so hard it left a mark. Neither of us made a sound. The light lingered on my backpack, specifically my backpack, the one with my work ID badge clipped to the strap, the one that had our county EMS logo on it, for what felt like a long time. Maybe 15 or 20 seconds before clicking off. Then very quietly, almost too quiet to make out, I heard a voice say, "Wrong tent." 2 words, that's it. And then footsteps moving away, unhurried, back toward wherever that truck had idled, and a few minutes later we heard the engine start up again and fade off down the service road. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light we woke up Josh and Colleen and told them everything, and Josh, without saying much, walked the perimeter of both sites and found fresh tire tracks on the service road maybe 80 yards from our tents, tracks that hadn't been there the day before. When we'd walked that stretch on a hike, we packed up immediately and drove straight to the ranger station near the highway junction, and I filed a report with the sheriff's office in Deschutes County that afternoon, describing Perry as closely as I could, giving them his name, which, when a deputy tried to run it later, didn't match any registered vehicle associated with the physical description Josh had given. And no campground registration on file under that name for that weekend either, even though we'd all seen him check in at the little office by the entrance. That's the detail that still won't leave me alone. He checked in. I watched him do it the first afternoon, walk up to the little kiosk, hand something to the person working it, get a site tag. But when the sheriff's office followed up with the campground days later, there was no registration record for Site 9 under any name matching Perry, and no camera footage from the kiosk that showed the transaction clearly enough to identify him, some technical issue with that particular camera. Apparently that the camp office couldn't explain, footage that was just corrupted or missing for roughly a 90-minute window that Friday afternoon, which happened to be exactly when we'd arrived. I still don't know what wrong tent meant. I've had a lot of time to think about it, working overnight shifts with nothing but my own thoughts and the radio between calls. And the two explanations I keep landing on are both awful in their own way. Either he had the wrong site, meaning there was a specific tent he was actually looking for somewhere else on that loop, and we happen to share a resemblance in some detail I'll never know. Tent color or gear placement or something, or he had the right site, and something about what he saw, maybe my badge, made him stop and reconsider. I don't know which one is worse. I still work nights. I still drive home alone in the early mornings, past mile markers where there's nobody else on the road, and I think about that voice more than I'd like to admit. Especially on the stretches where my headlights are the only light for miles. Story 4, what was left at the fire ring. I don't really know how to start this one except to just start it. My name's Kevin, I'm 29. I'm a full-time college student finishing up a degree in mechanical engineering at Colorado State. And I work part-time at a hardware store in Fort Collins to cover rent. This happened in October of 2025 at a dispersed camping spot off Forest Road 156 in the Roosevelt National Forest, up near Red Feather Lakes, Colorado. I want to explain dispersed camping for anyone who doesn't know, because it matters for how this whole thing unfolded. Dispersed camping means there's no official campground, no host, no check-in, no bathrooms, nothing. You just find a legal spot off a forest road, usually somewhere previous campers have already cleared a fire ring, and you set up there completely on your own, no oversight. No neighbors unless someone happens to pull into the same general area. I'd done it plenty of times before, usually alone, because I liked the quiet and I liked not having to talk to anybody. Especially during midterms when I needed to just get away from campus and clear my head. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, later in the season than I usually went, but the weather forecast looked decent, cold at night, in the 30s, but clear and dry. I found a spot I'd used once before, a small clearing about a quarter mile off the main forest road down a rough spur, with an existing fire ring built up out of stacked rocks, decent tree cover, and a view out over a little draw that dropped down toward a dry creek bed. No cell signal out there at all, which I knew going in. My mom hated it when I did that, but I told her exactly where I was going and when I'd be back, same as always. I got camp set up by late afternoon, just a one-person tent and a tarp shelter over my cooking area, nothing elaborate. I built a fire as it got dark, cooked some dinner, read for a while by headlamp, and turned in around 10. Completely unremarkable evening. I want to stress that because so much of what came after felt like it came out of nowhere, with zero build-up that first night. I woke up Friday to frost on the outside of my tent and a completely quiet forest, no wind, no birds even, just this heavy stillness that in hindsight I associate now with something being wrong. Even though at the time it just felt peaceful. I spent the day hiking a loop I'd scouted on a map beforehand, came back around 4 in the afternoon as the light was starting to go, and that's when I first noticed something off about my camp. My fire ring had been rebuilt, not disturbed, rebuilt. The rocks I'd arranged the night before in a rough oval had been taken apart and restacked into a tighter, more deliberate circle, almost too neat. Like someone had used a level, or at least taken real care with it. At first I thought maybe I was misremembering how I'd left it, but I was sure, because I specifically remembered one flat gray rock I'd placed at the north side, near where I'd been sitting. And it was gone from that position entirely, moved to the opposite side. I looked around the site for any other sign. My tent was untouched, zipped the way I'd left it. My food, which I'd hung from a tree branch about 80 feet away per proper practice, was also untouched, still hanging where I'd left it. Nothing was stolen. It was just the fire ring rebuilt, and for a while I genuinely tried to talk myself into believing some animal had somehow displaced the rocks. Even though that made no physical sense given how heavy some of them were and how precisely they'd been reset. I decided to stay anyway, mostly out of stubbornness and a little bit of embarrassment at how unsettled I felt over some rearranged rocks. I built a new fire in the rebuilt ring, didn't even think to tear it down and start over, which in hindsight feels like such an obvious thing I should have done, and had dinner. And told myself I'd just been careless the night before about how I remembered leaving things. Around 9:40 p.m., sitting by the fire, I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up before my brain even fully processed it. Someone, somewhere out past the tree line, humming. Low, tuneless, not really a melody so much as a kind of droning hum, rising and falling slightly, coming from the direction of the dry creek bed below my sight. I turned my headlamp off immediately, some instinct telling me not to be visible, and sat there completely still, straining to hear where exactly it was coming from. It went on for maybe 2 full minutes and then just stopped. I didn't sleep well that night, though nothing else happened. I kept my headlamp and a small hatchet, the only thing resembling a weapon I had, right by my sleeping bag, and every time I drifted off I'd jolt back awake at the smallest sound, a branch settling. The tent fabric shifting in a light breeze. Saturday morning I found the second thing. Sitting on the flat gray rock, the one that had been moved to the far side of the fire ring, was a small carved wooden figure, maybe 4 inches tall, roughly human-shaped, crude. Like something whittled with a pocket knife rather than any real tool. No real face, just suggestions of a head and limbs. It hadn't been there the night before, I was certain, because I'd sat on that exact rock while eating dinner and it had been bare. I picked it up, I probably shouldn't have, looking back, but I wasn't thinking clearly, and turned it over in my hands. On the flat underside, scratched in with what looked like the tip of a knife, were 3 letters, KWN. My name is Kevin, my middle name is Walter, my last name starts with N. I have never told anyone camping alone in that forest my full name, not out loud, not on any permit. Dispersed camping in that area doesn't require any registration at all. Which was exactly the appeal of it to me. No paper trail, no record of who was where. I want to describe the feeling of standing there, holding that thing, staring at those letters, because I don't think I've ever felt fear quite like it before or since. It wasn't the jump scare kind of fear. It was slower, colder, the kind that starts in your stomach and spreads out into your hands and makes your vision narrow slightly at the edges. Someone knew who I was. Someone had been close enough to me, possibly while I slept, to know details about me that I hadn't shared with anyone in that forest. I packed up as fast as I've ever packed up a campsite in my life, threw everything into my car without really organizing it, and started the drive out along the spur road toward the main forest road. About halfway along that quarter-mile stretch, my headlights caught something in the middle of the road, a man, standing completely still, facing my car, not moving out of the way. I stopped maybe 30 feet from him, engine running, my hands shaking on the wheel. He was tall, thin, wearing what looked like several layers of dark clothing despite it being mid-morning and not especially cold, and he had a long beard, unkempt, and he just stood there. Staring at my headlights, not shielding his eyes, not moving. I laid on my horn, he didn't flinch. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 15 or 20 seconds, genuinely trying to decide whether I could drive around him through the trees without getting my car stuck, or whether I should just reverse the whole way back up the spur. Then, without any change in his posture or expression that I could see from that distance, he stepped off to the side of the road into the brush and simply stood there, watching. As I drove past him at maybe 5 miles an hour, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him through my open window if I'd wanted to, which I absolutely did not. I didn't look at him directly as I passed. I kept my eyes on the road and just drove, and I didn't look in my rearview mirror until I was a good 100 yards past him, and when I finally did, the road behind me was empty. No one standing there, nothing. I drove straight to the county sheriff's substation in Red Feather Lakes and reported the whole thing, the rebuilt fire ring, the carved figure with my initials, the man on the road. The deputy who took my report was polite, but I could tell he didn't quite know what to do with any of it. There was no crime, technically, nothing stolen, nothing damaged. No threat that had been spoken aloud. He did ask to see the wooden figure, and I gave it to him, which I now sort of regret, because I never got any kind of documented evidence that it existed beyond his handwritten description in the report, and I never got it back. He said it would be logged, that they'd note the location for extra patrol attention given it was a known dispersed camping area, but he was honest with me that without an actual crime committed, there wasn't a lot they could actively pursue. I called back about 3 weeks later to ask if anything had come of it. He told me somewhat apologetically that the wooden figure had been misplaced somewhere in evidence intake, not lost exactly in his words, just not currently locatable, and that there'd been no other reports from that area in the meantime that matched what I'd described. I haven't gone dispersed camping since, not by myself, not anywhere without cell signal. I still think about that man standing in the road more than the figure itself, honestly, because the figure at least I can rationalize in pieces, someone watching me from a distance. Somehow learning my name, whittling something crude and leaving it as a kind of calling card. But the man in the road doesn't fit into any explanation I can make peace with. He wasn't panicked to see my car. He wasn't trying to hide. He looked like he was exactly where he meant to be, doing exactly what he meant to do, and the only thing that has ever genuinely scared me about it, more than anything else that weekend, is that stepping off to the side and just watching me pass felt less like someone letting me go and more like someone who'd already gotten whatever it was he'd come there for. Story 5, the cabin wasn't ours. I've been putting off writing this one down because, unlike some things that happen to you where the scary part is not knowing what happened, this one I understand pretty clearly, and understanding it hasn't made it easier to think about. My name's Holly. I'm 38, I'm a night shift pharmacist at a hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, and this happened in November of 2023 at a rental cabin near the Nantahala National Forest. Off a gravel road outside the small community of Wesser, close to the Nantahala Outdoor Center. I want to clarify up front that this wasn't tent camping, technically. It was a rustic rental cabin, the kind you book through one of those vacation rental sites. No real address beyond GPS coordinates and a set of directions the owner emailed us. No cell signal for the last 4 miles of the drive-in. I'm including it because it felt exactly like camping in every way that mattered. Remote, off-grid, no neighbors. Nothing but forest for miles, and honestly what happened there scared me worse than anything I've experienced actually sleeping in a tent. I went with my husband Dale and our friends from church, a couple named Grant and Sheila, for a long weekend in mid-November. Right after the leaves had mostly turned and the forest had that stripped, bare, early winter look to it. The cabin belonged to a man named Alistair, based on the listing, though we never actually met him in person. The whole booking and check-in process was done remotely, with a lockbox code emailed to us the morning we arrived. The listing photos showed a cozy 1-story cabin with a wraparound porch, a wood stove, 2 bedrooms, and a loft. We arrived Friday around 3 in the afternoon, after a long drive from Asheville. The last stretch on a narrow gravel forest road that switchbacked up through the trees for what felt like much longer than the 4 miles the directions said it would be. The cabin, when we finally found it, looked mostly like the pictures, maybe a little more weathered. Tucked into a clearing with dense forest pressing in close on 3 sides and a steep drop-off behind it that led down toward a creek we could hear but not see. The first strange thing, though none of us thought much of it at the time, was that the lockbox code didn't work. We tried it 4 or 5 times, checked the email twice to make sure we had it right, and it just wouldn't open. Dale ended up calling the emergency contact number listed in the booking, and after about 20 minutes on hold and a callback, a different code worked, and the person on the phone, not Alistair, someone who identified himself only as property management, apologized and said codes sometimes glitch and reset on their end. Inside, the cabin was clean, a little musty, decorated with the kind of generic rustic decor you'd expect: old snowshoes mounted on a wall, a taxidermied deer head over the fireplace, a shelf of paperback mysteries left behind by previous guests. We settled in, unpacked, got a fire going in the wood stove, and had a completely normal evening: cards, a bottle of wine, an early night given how tired we all were from the drive. Saturday we spent the day hiking a section of trail near the outdoor center, came back in the late afternoon, cooked dinner, and it was that evening when things started to feel wrong. Around 8, Sheila mentioned, almost in passing, that she thought she'd heard someone on the porch earlier in the day while the rest of us were down cleaning up from lunch, footsteps, and what she described as someone testing the front door handle, though when she'd looked out the window, no one had been there. She hadn't said anything at the time because she genuinely thought she was imagining it, but hearing herself describe it out loud that evening, she looked shaken in a way she hadn't been earlier. We didn't think a huge amount of it, Old Cabins Creek, and Grant pointed out that plenty of hikers use nearby trails and sometimes end up on private roads by accident, especially with spotty GPS out there. But around 10:30 that night, all 4 of us clearly heard it. Footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, circling from the front around toward a side window near the kitchen. Dale got up and looked out, and for a split second, he described this to me and to a sheriff's deputy the same way both times without variation. Which is part of why I believe him completely. He saw a face at the window, close to the glass, on the instant he registered it, before he could make out any real features beyond the impression of someone there. We turned on every light in the cabin. Grant found a fireplace poker and stood near the door. We called the emergency contact number again, and this time got no answer at all, just voicemail. We debated calling 911, but with no cell signal at the cabin itself. We'd noticed a landline in the kitchen, an old corded phone, which felt almost comically out of place until it became the only way we had to reach anyone. Dale used that to call the Swain County Sheriff's Office, and a deputy told him it could be 45 minutes to an hour before anyone could get out to a location that remote, especially at night on gravel roads. We sat together in the living room, all four of us, lights blazing, for that entire wait. Around 11:15 we heard something at the back door off the kitchen that led out toward the drop-off in the creek, not footsteps this time, but the doorknob itself turning slowly, audibly. The specific metallic sound of someone trying it from outside. We'd locked it, thank God, but we all watched that handle turn, hold, release, and turn again, 3 or 4 times in complete silence otherwise, no voice, no other sound at all. Sheila started crying quietly, and Grant kept saying, almost like a mantra, "It's locked, it's fine," more to convince himself than any of us. Then the turning stopped. We heard footsteps moving away from the back door, around toward the side of the cabin, and then nothing, just silence for almost 20 minutes, the four of us barely breathing. Until finally we saw headlights sweeping up the gravel road, and I have never in my life felt relief like the relief of seeing that sheriff's cruiser pull into the clearing. The deputy, a younger guy, maybe late 20s, name of Ferris, did a full walk of the property with his flashlight and his weapon drawn, but found no one. Though he did find footprints in the soft ground near the back door, a men's boot print, and interestingly, prints that seemed to lead not toward the main gravel road we'd driven in on, but down toward the drop-off behind the cabin, toward the creek, an area with no obvious trail or easy route out that he could see, which struck him as strange enough that he mentioned it specifically in his report. Here's where the story takes a turn I still have trouble fully processing, even now. Deputy Ferris asked, almost as a routine question, who we'd rented the cabin from, and when Dale gave him the name from the listing, Alastair, the deputy's expression changed. And he asked Dale to spell it, and then asked if we could show him the booking confirmation on our phones once we got signal again. He told us somewhat carefully that he recognized the property, that it had been the subject of a call a little over a year earlier, involving a different renter, a solo woman, who had reported almost the exact same thing, footsteps on the porch, someone testing the doors, and that in that earlier case. Deputies had eventually determined the person doing it was connected to the property itself somehow, though he was vague about the specifics. Said it was still an open matter, and he wasn't able to share more than that. We left before sunrise, all four of us packed and in the car within 20 minutes of getting that information, and the drive down that gravel road in full darkness. Headlights catching nothing but tree trunks and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting back from the underbrush felt like the longest 4 miles of my life. I contacted the rental site's customer support line about a week later, gave them everything, the deputy's name, the report number, all of it, and got back a form response about how seriously they take safety concerns. Followed weeks later by a notice that the listing had been temporarily removed pending review, with no further explanation offered despite 2 follow-up emails from me asking for one. I checked back on that listing periodically over the following year, and it eventually reappeared under a slightly different title, same photos as far as I could tell, same general location. Booked through a different host name entirely. I never found out who Alastair actually was, or whether that was even a real name, or what exactly the open matter the deputy referenced actually involved. I think about that solo woman sometimes, the one from the year before us, and I hope more than anything that whatever happened to her, she got out safely the way we did, and I hope, in some vague and probably useless way, that somebody eventually explains to both of us what any of it actually meant. I still can't fully explain why, of everything that happened that night, it's the sound of that doorknob turning over and over, patient and unhurried, that wakes me up sometimes, months later. In my own house, in my own bed, certain for just a second that I've heard it again. Story 6, Group Site B. I've told bits and pieces of this to different people over the last year, but never the whole thing start to finish. Mostly because it involves someone I used to consider a friend, and I still feel weird about how it makes him look. My name's Owen. I'm 41, I manage a warehouse for a regional auto parts distributor outside Columbus, Ohio, and this happened over Memorial Day weekend in 2025 at a group campsite in Hocking Hills State Park. At a reservable site off the road near Old Man's Cave. Every year, a loose group of us from my old college fraternity, maybe 15 guys, give or take who could make it, gets together for a camping weekend. It's become a tradition over almost 2 decades at this point. Wives and girlfriends mostly staying home, kids too, just a guy's weekend, beer, a big group fire, terrible camp food. The same jokes rehashed every year. We'd reserved Group Site B, which at Hocking Hills is a large cleared area meant for exactly this kind of thing, multiple tents, a shared fire ring, a picnic shelter, parking close by. This year, one of the guys, a friend named Terrence who I've known since freshman year, brought along a +1 none of us had met before, a guy named Colton, who Terrence said he'd started hanging out with through a men's hiking group he joined a year or so earlier after his divorce. Terrence vouched for him, said he was a good guy, into the outdoors, easygoing. Colton was maybe mid-30s, quiet at first, kept mostly to himself the first evening, while the rest of us did our usual loud reminiscing. I want to say the first night was completely normal. We ate too much, drank too much, somebody brought a guitar and butchered a few songs, and we all crashed in our respective tents, scattered around the group site sometime after 1 a.m. Nothing unusual. Saturday was a full day. Some of us hiked down to Old Man's Cave and Ash Cave. Some guys just sat around camp all day drinking, the usual split. I noticed over the course of the day that Colton had attached himself pretty specifically to a guy named Priest. That's actually his last name. Everyone's called him Priest since college. First name's Aaron, but nobody uses it, who'd brought his 16-year-old son, Caleb, along for his first time at the trip. Colton spent a lot of that Saturday talking to Caleb specifically, more than seemed proportionate given the size of the group, asking him about school, about sports. Offering to show him some knot-tying stuff he apparently knew from scouting years ago. None of us thought much of it in the moment. It's the kind of thing that, described after the fact, sounds obviously alarming, but in the moment, at a guy's camping trip full of dads and former scouts. A guy showing a teenager how to tie a taut line hitch just looked like normal camp culture. Priest even thanked him for it later that evening, said Caleb had been having a good time. It was Saturday night late, probably close to midnight, when I first noticed something that actually bothered me. I'd gotten up to walk over to the shared fire, which had burned down low, most guys having gone to bed, just a handful of us still up drinking and talking. Colton wasn't in that group. I noticed his tent, which was pitched at the far edge of the clearing, was unzipped and empty, headlamp and everything still sitting inside visible through the mesh, but no Colton. I didn't think a lot of it at first, figured he'd gone to use the restroom facilities, which were maybe a 5-minute walk down the access road. But when I glanced toward Priest and Caleb's tent, pitched maybe 30 feet from the fire, I could make out, in the dim ambient light, someone standing just outside it, not moving, facing the tent. I called out casually, "Hey, you good?" And the figure, which I could now tell was Colton, turned toward me and said, in a completely normal, unbothered tone, "Yeah, just checking the guy line." Thought it looked loose earlier. He walked back to his own tent right after that, and I went back to the fire and didn't think much more of it that night. Though something about how quickly and smoothly he'd had an explanation ready stuck with me in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time. Sunday morning, Caleb came and found his dad while a bunch of us were cooking breakfast, and I overheard him say, quietly, clearly not wanting to make a scene, "Dad, that guy Colton was outside our tent last night, like, standing right outside it." I woke up and saw his shadow through the fabric for a long time before he left. Priest's whole demeanor changed immediately. I watched it happen. This kind of controlled tightening in his face, and he asked Caleb how long, and Caleb said he wasn't sure, but it felt like a while. Long enough that he'd pretended to be asleep the whole time out of some instinct he couldn't explain. Priest pulled Terrence aside first, since Terrence was the one who'd brought Colton, and I happened to be close enough to hear most of it. Terrence looked genuinely rattled, said he'd only known Colton for about 8 months through the hiking group, that he seemed like a normal guy. That he had no idea what to make of what Caleb had described. Priest, to his credit, didn't escalate it in front of the whole group or make a scene with Colton directly. He just quietly packed up his and Caleb's gear, told a few of us close by what was going on, and left the campsite entirely that morning, several hours before he'd planned to. The rest of us were left in this uncomfortable position of not really knowing what to do. Colton, for his part, seemed to have no idea anything was wrong. He was friendly at breakfast, chatted normally, asked where Priest and Caleb had gone. And when someone told him vaguely that they'd had to head out early for a family thing, he just nodded and didn't push it. I want to be honest that a part of the group, myself included at first, tried to rationalize it. Maybe he really was checking a guy line. Maybe a 16-year-old half asleep in an unfamiliar tent misjudged how long a shadow lingered. Maybe it was nothing. But over the course of that Sunday, as the day went on, a few more small things surfaced that made the rationalizing harder to sustain. One of the younger guys in the group, a guy named Desmond who'd brought his own 12-year-old nephew along, mentioned that Colton had asked him, seemingly out of nowhere the day before, whether the nephew camped alone in his own tent or shared with him, a question Desmond had found strange enough to remember but hadn't connected to anything until now. Another guy recalled Colton asking pointed questions about which kids were coming on the trip before we'd even left Columbus. Questions that had seemed like normal friendly interest at the time, but read very differently in hindsight. By Sunday afternoon, a small group of us, myself, Terrence, and 2 other longtime members of the group, decided to talk to Colton directly, as calmly as we could manage, and just ask him outright about the tent. He didn't get defensive, which somehow made it worse rather than better. He just repeated the guideline explanation, almost word for word the same as he'd given me the night before. Flat and rehearsed sounding in a way that hadn't struck me at midnight, but struck me very clearly in broad daylight. When Terrence asked why he'd need to check a guideline on someone else's tent rather than his own, he paused for what felt like a long time and said, "I don't know." "I just noticed it," we told him, as diplomatically as any of us could manage under the circumstances, that we thought it'd be best if he headed out. He didn't argue. He packed up without any visible anger or protest, which somehow unsettled me more than if he'd gotten upset, and drove off in his own vehicle sometime around 3 that afternoon. Terrence called around to some contacts in the hiking group over the following weeks, trying to get more background on who Colton actually was. And what he found was thin. The group itself was pretty informal. People came and went. Nobody had known Colton for more than a year or so, and one woman Terrence spoke with mentioned, almost as an aside, that Colton had stopped showing up to group hikes a few months before our trip. Around the same time, a family with 2 young kids had also stopped attending, though she didn't know if the 2 things were connected and didn't want to speculate. We never filed a police report, which in hindsight I regret, mostly because nothing that happened was technically a crime. Standing outside a tent isn't illegal. Asking questions about kids isn't illegal, and we had nothing beyond a 16-year-old's account of a shadow lingering longer than felt right. Priest and I have talked about it since, and he told me he did eventually mention it to Caleb's school counselor, just to have it somewhere on record. But there was never anything more concrete to report beyond a feeling, a pattern of small details that added up to something none of us could name cleanly. Terrence hasn't organized another camping trip since, and honestly, none of us have pushed him to. I think about Caleb sometimes, about him lying there pretending to be asleep, trying to decide how long was too long for a shadow to stay still outside a fabric wall. And I think about how close that whole weekend came to looking, from the outside, like absolutely nothing at all, just some guys, a fire. A quiet kid who happened to wake up at the wrong moment and notice something the rest of us, adults who should have known better, almost talked ourselves out of taking seriously. Story 7, Ranger Station 4. This is the last one I've got, and honestly it's the one I think about the most. Probably because I was the one with the most training to handle a bad situation, and it still didn't feel like enough. My name's Whitney, I'm 30, and at the time this happened, in August of 2023, I was working a seasonal job as a backcountry ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, stationed at a small outpost, really just a converted trailer with a radio setup, in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming, along a stretch of the Gros-Ventre drainage east of Jackson. Part of my job that summer was doing overnight patrols, camping solo at a rotating set of established backcountry sites to check permits, monitor bear activity, and generally have a visible presence for the hikers and campers coming through. I'd done maybe a dozen of these solo patrol nights already that season without incident, and I felt about as prepared as a person can feel for that kind of work. I carried bear spray, a sidearm as part of my ranger equipment, a satellite communicator for when I was out of radio range, and I knew the terrain in that drainage about as well as anyone. The night this happened, I was camped at a site we referred to internally as Ranger Station 4, though it wasn't a station at all. Just a flat bench of ground above a bend in the Gros-Ventre River that rangers used regularly as a patrol camp, maybe 6 miles in from the nearest trailhead. I'd hiked in that afternoon, checked permits for 2 backpacking parties I passed on the way, and set up my tent in the same spot I'd used probably 4 times already that summer. Everything about that evening was routine until close to 10 p.m., when I did my scheduled radio check-in with the district office and mentioned, just as a passing observation, that I'd noticed a set of fresh boot prints on the trail near my camp that didn't match either of the 2 parties I'd checked permits for earlier that day, a size that seemed too small to be an adult man's, but with a stride length that suggested someone tall, an odd combination I made a mental note of but didn't think much more about at the time. The dispatcher on the other end, a guy named Foster who I'd worked with most of the season, told me to keep an eye out and radio in if anything else came up, standard stuff. I fell asleep around 11, and I woke up at 1:52 a.m. to my satellite communicator buzzing with an incoming message, not from dispatch, which would have shown up differently, but a message sent to the device's emergency contact channel, the kind of thing that's really only supposed to be used by someone with the device's specific ID trying to reach me directly. The message just said, "Wrong site, sorry, no name, no further explanation." I want to explain why that terrified me more than almost anything else in this story, because I don't think it's obvious unless you understand the equipment. That message channel isn't something a random person can access. It requires either physical possession of my device or specific technical knowledge of the messaging protocol paired with the device's unique identifier, which isn't public information. It's registered internally with the Forest Service for exactly this kind of solo field work. Sitting there in my tent at 2 a.m., staring at that message, my first fully formed thought was that someone had my device information, which meant someone had access to internal Forest Service data, or had gotten it from somewhere I couldn't account for. I radioed dispatch immediately, got Foster again, and read him the message. He was quiet for a second, and then told me something that made my stomach drop even further. He checked, and there was no record of that message being sent from any registered device on their end. No log of it at all in the system that tracks all communicator traffic for accountability. As far as the Forest Service's own records were concerned, that message hadn't happened, even though I was looking at it, time-stamped, sitting right there on my screen. Foster told me to sit tight, that he'd get someone moving toward my location, but with the terrain and the hour, realistic help was probably 2 hours out at best. I sat in my tent with my sidearm actually drawn and resting across my knees, which I'd never done before in any previous solo patrol, listening to every sound the forest made, the river below. Wind moving through the lodgepole pines, an owl at one point that made me jump so hard I nearly discharged the weapon into my own tent wall. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the trail, and unlike some of the other stories I've heard from friends who have had similar experiences, these weren't slow or deliberate, they were fast, almost stumbling, like someone moving with real urgency or distress rather than stealth. I called out, identifying myself as a Forest Service ranger, told whoever it was to stop and identify themselves. The footsteps stopped. A voice, female, young-sounding, maybe late teens or early 20s, called back, shaking audibly even through the distance and the dark. "Please, is someone there? I need help." My dad, and then it just cut off, replaced by what sounded like crying or maybe hyperventilating, hard to distinguish at that distance. Every instinct I had told me this needed real caution, not because I doubted someone might genuinely be in distress. But because everything about the night up to that point had already been so wrong that I couldn't take anything at face value anymore. I told her to stay where she was and to keep talking to me so I could hear her location, and I got my headlamp on and moved toward the sound, weapon still drawn but lowered. Sweeping the beam carefully, I found her maybe 60 yards from my camp, sitting on the ground near the trail, a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, in shorts and a t-shirt, no pack, no gear of any kind, barefoot. Which struck me immediately as deeply wrong for someone supposedly out backpacking. She was shaking, crying, and when I asked her what happened, she said her father had gone somewhere and that she'd been trying to find the trailhead for hours, that she was scared. That she didn't know where she was. I want to be honest that everything about the encounter felt off in a way I can't fully explain even now with the benefit of hindsight and training. She had no visible injuries despite claiming to have been lost and hiking for hours, no gear at all, no shoes, and when I asked basic orienting questions, where had they parked? What trailhead had they started from? How long had they been out there? Her answers were vague in a way that felt less like confusion or shock, and more like she genuinely didn't have those details to give, like she was improvising. I radioed Foster again, gave him her description. Told him I was bringing her back to my camp to wait for the response team, rather than trying to navigate 6 miles of dark trail with someone barefoot and in her condition. As we walked back, she stayed maybe 5 or 6 feet behind me the whole way, which I noted but didn't push on given the circumstances, and it wasn't until we were almost back at my tent that I heard. From somewhere off in the trees to our left, a second set of footsteps, moving parallel to us, matching our pace almost exactly. I stopped, told her to stop, and called out again, identifying myself, telling whoever was out there to come into the light. The footsteps stopped instantly. The young woman standing next to me went completely silent and still in a way that felt different from her crying and shaking moments before, a kind of stillness that, looking back, felt less like fear and more like listening, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when I made a decision I still think about constantly. I told her directly that I needed her to walk ahead of me the rest of the way back to camp, where I could see her the whole time. She didn't argue, but something in her expression shifted, just for a second, in the beam of my headlamp, not fear, but something closer to disappointment. Like a plan hadn't worked out the way it was supposed to. We made it back to my tent without further incident, and I had her sit near the fire ring while I stood, weapon still in hand, watching the tree line in the direction those parallel footsteps had come from. Nothing else approached. About 90 minutes later, well before actual sunrise, I saw headlamps coming up the trail, 2 other rangers. Foster having gotten a team moving faster than his initial 2-hour estimate once I'd reported a second person on scene. The young woman gave a statement to the rangers who arrived and later to a Teton County Sheriff's deputy, and her account grew increasingly inconsistent under questioning, details about her father. About where they'd started hiking, about how long they'd been out, none of it lining up, none of it matching any missing persons report or trailhead registration for that area. She was eventually transported out for a welfare evaluation, and I never learned what became of her afterward. That information wasn't something that got shared back down to me. Given privacy protocols, and I've never found any public record, news report, or case file that explains who she actually was, who or what the second set of footsteps belonged to, or how she'd gotten that satellite communicator message sent from my supposedly secure, untraceable device. I finished out that season, but I didn't come back to that job the following summer. I tell people it was because I wanted a change, which is technically true. But the real reason is that I've never been able to shake the image of her face in that half second before I told her to walk ahead of me, that flicker of disappointment. Like I'd done something wrong by not doing whatever it was expected of me. I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't made her walk in front. I don't know who or what was moving through the trees alongside us that night, matching our pace with an evenness that no genuinely frightened, lost person's companion would have managed. And I still have that message saved, screenshotted on an old phone in a drawer at my parents' house. Wrong site. Sorry, 2 words explaining nothing, from a device that officially, as far as any system of record is concerned, was never there at all. That's all 7 stories for this one. If there's a thread running through all of them, it's this: the woods don't actually take you away from other people. They just make it harder to tell who's really out there with you, and easier for someone to get closer than they ever could back home, without you noticing until it's already too late. If you camp, hopefully none of this keeps you off the trails for good. Most nights out there really are just wind in the trees and a good fire and nothing else. But maybe check your zippers before you go to sleep tonight. Maybe don't be so quick to wave off the guy watching a little too long from the next site over. And if you ever get a message on a device that's not supposed to be able to send one, don't wait around to find out who sent it. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through all 7 of these. If one of these stories got under your skin more than the others, let me know which one down in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you or someone you know has a true camping story of your own, something that still doesn't sit right with you, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Some of the best stories on this channel started out as a comment nobody expected me to read. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because there are a lot more of these coming. And whatever you've got planned for your next trip into the woods, stay safe out there. Really, I'll see you in the next one.